Swedish designers have a good reputation. It doesn't matter what they produce, be it chainsaws or trucks, they build high quality and well thought out mechanisms. Perhaps this is their national trait. It's also true for the Swedish tanks. The country, which hasn't been in a war for the last 100 years, was able to create its own tank building school. During the First and Second World Wars, Sweden remained a neutral country and didn't fight. However, the Swedes paid close attention to the militaries. They became interested in tanks right after these vehicles appeared at the end of World War I. At first, they wanted to buy a vehicle from the inventors of this new weapon, the British. The British set the price at 40,000 Swedish krona for their Mark tank. It was too expensive, and the deal fell through. The Swedes bought their first tank from the Germans after the war. The most famous German vehicle of the World War I era is the A7V, designed by Joseph Vollmer. It was huge, like a moving fortress, and had the largest number of crewmen in history. But Sweden needed another vehicle, which was disregarded by the German generals.
Being a smart man, Vollmer realized that the vehicle was a bit expensive, even for Germany. That's why, at the same time, he was developing a lighter and cheaper tank, which utilized a greater number of car parts. This tank was designated the LK2. The machine gun and cannon versions of this tank were developed, so the Swedes were particularly interested in this vehicle.
The LK2 cost the Swedes half as much as the British rhomboid, 18,000 krona.
These tanks in 1921, it was a big secrecy. And that is for two reasons. The first, they didn't want to tell the world that Sweden actually bought tanks from Germany. So in the papers, they were designed as tractor parts. The other reason is that it has been said, we haven't found any document, but it has been said that these tanks were not intended to use against an enemy from another country. But if Sweden would have had a revolution, these tanks should have been used to protect the king and the government against the revolution in Sweden. So there were two reasons to keep this secret.
So the German LK2 became a Scandinavian named the Stridsvagn FM21. For some time, the Swedish military decided that it was enough.
The Swedes were just running different tests on this tank. They tried to understand what it was and how much they needed it.
Having summarized their experience, the Swedish military defined the requirements for a new tank in the late 1920s. Besides the traditional requests of a bigger gun and thicker armor, the Swedish specificity was also taken into consideration.
A poor Nordic country, the Swedish north was a completely wild area where the Laplanders roamed on reindeer. The population was low, industry was underdeveloped. There were many forests, lakes, rivers and other obstacles in the country that were hard for the tanks to overcome. The Swedes had to keep in mind that there wasn't a lot of money in the treasury. They couldn't build everything they wanted. But sometimes they also remembered an old proverb, "We're not rich enough to buy cheap things," and tried to design expensive and high-quality things. Among other things, their own tank program meant a certain share of confidence in the future. And if you look at post-war Europe, you'll see that everyone was working on tank development, even Germany, who weren't allowed to.
So the Swedish military ordered a light vehicle weighing no more than 12 tons, so that most bridges could cope with their weight. A tank should not only fight well, but also reach the battlefield in time. It was a very strict requirement at the time. Track durability in the 1920s was poor. Tanks couldn't go long distances under their own power, just a few dozen kilometers. A combined wheel and track laying system became a solution. Tanks should move on tracks when in battle and on wheels when on the road. Such a vehicle was introduced by the Landsverk company. The L5 tank was lightly armored and armed with a 37mm gun and 2 machine guns. The main feature of the vehicle was its original running gear.
The tank had a normal track-laying mover, as well as 4 large wheels. Moreover, the transition from one mover to another didn't require much crew effort. A special system was designed for this, and it took a couple of minutes to do so. The tank rolled to the battlefield, the tanker pulled a couple of levers, and the vehicle switched to tracks.
The tank didn't pass the trials. but two vehicles were built on its base: the tracked L10 and the combined tracked and wheeled L30. Regarding its armament and armour, it was a standard light tank with a maximum 14 mm of armour, a 37 mm gun and a coaxial machine gun. Changing the mover was done so quickly that it didn't require the crew to leave the vehicle. It was a big advantage in comparison to the Christie tanks.
So you have the track system as an ordinary tank to drive off-road in the terrain. But to be able to drive on roads, you also had connected to the chassis, you had big road wheels. And when you drove in the terrain, these tracks were used and the road wheels were up in the air. But when you were going out into the ordinary road, you could lower these wheels and then you could drive on the road with the wheels. And with this system you had high mobility with the tracks in the terrain and also high speed possibility on road, up to 75 kilometers an hour.
But the L30 was too good and expensive for the Swedish budget. As a result, only one prototype was built. The military preferred the tracked L10. It didn't roll that fast on the road, but it was simpler and better armoured. However, only 3 vehicles were built. These were the first tanks developed in Sweden. But technically, they weren't Swedish.
The Germans were involved in their development. According to the Versailles Treaty, Germany wasn't allowed to design its own tanks. But when something is prohibited and you really want it, there are always ways around.
The German Krupp company bought out the bankrupt Swedish railroad car company and turned it into a tank building branch. It was the Landsverk company.
The German Otto Merker made the biggest contribution to Swedish tank building. He was a tank designer that laid the foundation for the Swedish tank building school. In fact, the Germans actively used all their neighbors who harbored them. As a result, Germany experimented with submarines and aircraft in the Netherlands and tested tanks in the Soviet Union and Sweden. And they tested artillery in a great many places.
In the early 1930s, Otto Merker started modernizing the L10. The result of his work was one of the best light tanks of that time. The first mass-produced Swedish tank, the L60. It weighed only 9 tons, was very comfortable for the crew, and became the first mass-produced tank in the world to be equipped with torsion bar suspension. Its first version was only exported. 2 tanks were bought by Ireland. Austria and Hungary bought 1 each. The Hungarians developed their own tank on the L60 base, the 38M Toldi. The improved variant, STRV M38, entered service in the Swedish Army.
If we take only technical characteristics, the Swedes had one of the best tanks in the world before the beginning of World War II.
It was one of the most successful Swedish pre-war tanks. Its modifications remained in service up to the mid-1950s. The L60 is the only Swedish tank that had to fight. It happened in the Dominican Republic during the American landing.
They were unlucky to engage in combat against the Patton tanks, and of course, it ended badly for the pre-war light tanks. The L60 was knocked down.
Nevertheless, the last 5 vehicles of this type were removed from service in the early 2000s. The Landsverks were excellent vehicles. But the tank industry capabilities couldn't keep up with the desire of the Swedes to equip the army with tanks as soon as possible. The example of the neighboring Denmark and Norway, which were occupied by Germany, showed what neutrality, not backed by the force of arms, was worth.
It was a problem for Sweden, but it was also a blessing. The Swedish engineers were good with their hands, but there were very few engineers, and they couldn't produce a lot of vehicles and make them cheap.
In the late 1930s, the Czech Czechadair company developed a small tank, a tankette, on Sweden's request. It was introduced into service as the STRV M37 AH4. The combat value of a machine gun tankette wasn't high, but they served as training vehicles until the late 1950s. In order to expand their tank park as soon as possible, the Swedes bought another checkered air vehicle, the LT VZ-38. Although the Czech vehicles were outmatched by the Landsverk vehicles, it was easier to produce them.
If you put one vehicle against the other in an open field, the Swedish vehicle would win. But the thing is, tanks almost never fought in an open field.
This is how the STRV M41, also known as the TNHSV, appeared in the Swedish army. It was different from the Czech, with its radio mounted in the turret and engine. The STRV M41 tanks were decommissioned in the late 1950s, but their service didn't end. The thrifty Swedes used the running gear of the old vehicle for the PBV 301 armored personnel carriers. Another vehicle based on the Czech one became the SAV M43 self-propelled gun. Storm Artilleriwagen, assault artillery vehicle. The Swedes paid close attention to what was happening on the World War II battlefields, and the successful use of the German Sturmgeschütz didn't go unnoticed. The Swedish designers first mounted a 75mm gun in a fixed semi-open cabin, and then the SPG was rearmed with a 105mm Bofors howitzer. A total of 36 vehicles were built, which served until the 1970s. By 1940, Sweden had two types of rather modern light tanks in its tank park. But it was clear that light tanks alone were not enough. In early 1941, the Swedish military defined the requirements for a heavier vehicle. Front armor no less than 55mm thick and a 75mm gun. A tank created by the Landsverk designers, following those requirements, was put into service. Its production was launched in early 1943. Unfortunately, during the war, the tanks were improving faster than the unhurried Scandinavians were producing them. A project that looked pretty good in early 1941 was completely obsolete by 1943.
When we asked at the Hesselholms Museum why the gun was so short, a museum worker told us that Swedish law was one of the reasons. According to law, the gun mustn't protrude beyond the vehicle's hull.
The weak anti-tank characteristics of the STRV M42 with its short 75mm gun were obvious immediately. The Swedes also clearly saw that the development of a new tank or modernization of the current one could drag on and on. But vehicles capable of fighting effectively against the modern tanks of a potential adversary were needed right now. The Swedes did the same as their colleagues in other countries. They created an anti-tank self-propelled gun on a ready chassis. A new long-barrel 75mm gun was mounted on the M42 base. Front armor was 70mm thick, but the crewmen of the new SPGs had to forget about the traditionally good ergonomics of the Swedish tanks.
The same museum worker who we talked to in Hesselholms told us that the gunner of this SPG had to have pole dancing skills because his left leg literally twisted around the device and he walked quite strangely for some time after he had left the vehicle.
The development of this SPG dragged on as well. Although the first prototype was built in the winter of 1943, due to a delay in the gearbox development, the first mass-produced PVKV M43s were shipped to the Army in only 1946. There wasn't much to choose from. Until 1953, the M43 was the only vehicle at least somewhat capable of fighting against modern tanks. The Swedes managed to solve this problem by purchasing the Centurions.
Sweden faced both financial and industrial limitations, as well as the fact that weapons improve most during a war. The USA, USSR, and France had enormous experience in this, and they just had to adapt it to certain requirements. But the Swedes had been on the lookout for what they really needed for quite a while. Like, what do we need? Do we need exactly this? Maybe we should try that, and so on. Their post-war program